From the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, this is Taxed and Wasted, a podcast about tax, regulation, and waste. I'm your host, Emilio Garcia. Welcome back to Taxed and Wasted by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. In a little bit, we're going to talk to Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire about libertarianism versus conservatism. Tune in for that a little bit later, but before we do that, we're going to go through the news of the week that we found relevant. And since we are the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, we're going to talk about a new tax that the taxpayers are going to be burdened with. We all know about the NBN debacle. That was the failed, horrible $51 billion infrastructure project that has been rolled out over the last few years. When this infrastructure project, this terrible idea, was proposed, we were assured that we would be paid back for this project. Not that it should have been greenlit to begin with, but that's a totally separate thing. And apparently, the government's plan to pay the taxpayer back for the $51 billion that they misappropriated is to tax the taxpayer again, but only if they don't use that service. So let me explain. Right now, obviously the NBN is a disaster. It provided us with slightly less subpar internet speeds than we had before, but it's just finished being rolled out. And so, if you use the internet, but you don't use the NBN, you are going to get taxed in order for the government to pay back the taxpayer. So if you're like me and you hired the NBN, you're off the hook. You are not going to have to deal with this tax. But if you get your internet from any provider that does not provide you with NBN, your bill is about to get $7 and a few cents more expensive. Obviously, this is absurd. It's ridiculous that we would have to deal with such a terribly expensive, failed infrastructure project, but to then tax people who don't use it in order to pay them back, essentially, is an outrage. And I know that $7 and a few cents doesn't seem like a huge amount, but just consider if you're paying $50 a month or more for your internet currently, and it's not the NBN, well, the difference between $50 and $57 may seem arbitrary, but it does hurt a little bit more, doesn't it? The NBN has also announced, apparently, whoever's handling it, that they're not going to be transparent with us. So usually you would expect, well, all right, you already kind of pushed this horrible, terrible project on us. Well, at least we get to be informed of how it does over the years as it helps Australians, supposedly. They're actually not going to tell us what the profits or losses are for the NBN. So they've announced there's going to be no transparency. We're not going to know how much money the NBN is losing or how much profit they're making. So we just have to accept that the NBN is what it is. You're going to have to accept your tax if you don't have the NBN, and that's the end of the story. Seems outrageous. We want to repeal this tax. If you want to help us, please go to our website, taxpayers.org.au, and you can find more information there. Speaking of getting rid of taxes, repealing taxes, there's a push to scrap the luxury car tax. We had this tax in place because we wanted to protect the local industry, mainly Holden. We want to protect this car manufacturer, and it's gone. Holden is no longer. And this has begged the question among many Australians, reasonably so, why do we still need this tax? Now, we would argue that this tax should have never really been implemented to begin with, but now that there's nothing left to protect, then why is this protectionist measure still in place? Now, the Treasurer has apparently resisted calls and acted with some reservations when bringing up the possibility of repealing this tax, but without Holden, there's apparently enough pressure to make him consider getting rid of this tax. And hopefully, it's unfortunate for everyone who has purchased a car over 63,000, I believe it is, having to have paid that tax in the past. But cars are going to get less expensive, hopefully. So that's some good news. Finally, there is some good news this week. Moving on now, we wanted to touch on the cash ban very quickly. I don't want to stay on the cash ban too long because it's still kind of up in the air. Tomorrow, which is going to be the 21st, Friday, you're probably going to get this on Tuesday, we're going to get a report from the Senate inquiry into the cash ban. We don't know what is going to be in there, but following that, probably on the 27th of February, we're going to actually have a vote. Now, they've been moving the vote a lot, so it could be the case that by the next time that you're listening to the podcast, the cash ban bill has either failed or passed. But it's important to keep an eye on that. We are obviously pushing strongly against the cash ban, and you can help us push against the cash ban as well by going to our website, taxpayers.org.au/don't-ban-cash, and sending a tweet to your MP. Let them know that you're not happy about this. If you haven't heard about the cash ban, which we've discussed amply, the cash ban is a bill that proposes that there be a restriction on purchases in cash over $10,000. This figure, $10,000, is not tagged to inflation, which means that every single year you get to spend less and less in cash. And it also has a strange provision there that says we're not going to restrict transactions in Bitcoin or in cryptocurrency over $10,000 unless the transactions become popular, in which case we'll implement that too. Just terrible. And we're obviously dealing with a bill that is completely just a corporatist bill that is going to award a lot to the big banks. Now, you will have to necessarily go through a bank for large transactions. Business owners will have to. It's just a terrible bill. So the Greens and Labor have come out against it. Kudos. And we will keep you up to date, but you can definitely help us by contacting your MP. Moving on, ScoMo has said that he's going to take an approach of technology over taxation on his approach to climate change. Now, obviously, things have not been going well for ScoMo politically. He apologized for the crime of taking a vacation and spending Christmas with his family while there were some bushfires here in Australia. He then claimed that it had always been the position of his government that extreme weather events such as bushfires were influenced strongly by climate change, which is a verifiable falsehood. And so this seems to be his way to kind of return to the position that he held before on climate change, which is we obviously have an eye towards a reduction in CO2 emissions. We want cleaner air. We want to make sure that we're not being feckless about the issue, but we're not going to kill industry. We're not going to get rid of jobs. We're not going to burden Australians to do so because there's a give and take. So we will probably hear a lot of pushback on that front because, of course, climate alarmists think that the only way to solve climate change is to tax everyone back into the Stone Age. But, of course, poverty doesn't solve climate change. So we definitely want to, it's always good to have a variety of energy sources. Cleaner energy is fantastic. Energy that is cheaper is fantastic. So that's why we, of course, back nuclear. But climate activists don't like nuclear for some strange reason. But this is a good approach by ScoMo. If you want to encourage different industries to innovate and to provide Australians with cleaner, cheaper energy, we are 100% for that. We're going to end really quickly with some praise for Senator James McGrath, who has said that the government needs to act with more transparency. Absolutely agree. Currently, the government has some quote-unquote transparency measures. They're a joke. Supposedly, if you go into some kind of, let's just put it this way. The government makes a lot of information available to the public, but it's so complicated, so hard to find, it is nearly impossible to actually learn anything. So they can claim that there's transparency because you can access different terribly complicated long spreadsheets and PDFs spattered around the many, many websites that exist from the Australian government. But if you, as a taxpayer, or let's say even someone who's looking into the government for journalistic purposes, if you actually want to find any specific figure from government spending or from the government doing anything else that relates to government and governance, it's going to be extremely hard for you to do it. You have to actually know what you're doing. So James McGrath has said there should be a transparency portal, and all government expenditures should be easily accessible to everybody through there. Absolutely agree. We have already seen tons of scandals of politicians spending our money completely irresponsibly in ways that are completely unjustifiable. We see just an incredible lack of fiscal conservatism here in Australia, and having the Australian people being able to look easily at clear numbers is a fantastic initiative. We stand fully behind him, and good on James McGrath for pushing this issue. We look forward to getting on the transparency portal every single day and just picking apart every single unnecessary expenditure on behalf of the government. That about brings us to the end of our news review. If you haven't already, please subscribe. And now, please enjoy our interview with Michael Knowles. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So for the very few who don't know who you are, do you want to tell us a little bit?
Sure. I host a show at the Daily Wire, which is called The Michael Knowles Show, very creatively named. And I also host a show with the U.S. Senator Ted Cruz called Verdict. And I also host a show for PragerU, which is called The Book Club. And that's just it's a less political show. It's a show where we just talk about some of the great books that everyone should read, but nobody does read because our schools have fallen apart. And I also write, and contribute op-eds to various places. And probably my magnum opus is that I once published, though I can't say I wrote, a completely blank book called Reasons to Vote for Democrats, a Comprehensive Guide, which, thank you so much. Thank you for reading my scholarly work. Very surprisingly, but hilariously, jumped to #1 on the bestseller charts.
Right. Well, I think that's because Trump gave it a plug, didn't he?
He did. It's funny. The book jumped to #1 on its own, pretty much just because American conservatives were having so much fun after the 2016 election. And it was there on its own for about a week or so. And then it obviously started to dip eventually. And then the president saw it and tweeted his endorsement of it. And it goes right back up to the top for another week or so.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And
so much.
let's have some fun with libertarianism and conservatism. So the reason that I asked you to be on is because there's a really interesting debate kind of between the classical libertarian and the traditionalist conservative side of politics.
Yes.
And so before we get into where they kind of differ, where do you think the important overlaps are? Because a lot of people see kind of libertarians and conservatives as largely on the same boat.
Yes, and in the American experience in particular, but I suppose throughout the entire Anglosphere, including Australia and the UK, you see a lot of overlap as well. So, one thing about conservatives is you can get 10 conservatives in a room and you can be guaranteed that not a single one of them will agree with any of the other ones. We're always sort of pointing out where we differ and debating those things, which is a difference with the left. The left on the other hand, seems to really strive for uniformity of thought.
Sure.
There's not really much division anymore. It's just all under the banner of progressivism. So I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of overlap. Obviously, there was a very intentional overlap between libertarianism and conservatism or traditionalism for the latter half of the 20th century, and that was an intentional movement by William F. Buckley Jr. and Frank Meyer and a number of other journalists and philosophers and conservative
Mm.
activists, probably Ronald Reagan most famously, who created this philosophy or ideology of fusionism, which brought together the economic libertarians, the social traditionalists, and the foreign policy hawks, all
Mm.
who had this common enemy in the Soviet Union. So the traditionalists and the religious right, for instance, despised the Soviet Union because it was godless, atheistic, anti-religious. The
Right.
economic libertarians opposed the Soviet Union for collectivism, and the Cold War hawks didn't like the Soviet Union's imperialist ambitions. But when you looked
Mm.
at the coalition itself, they didn't seem to have a whole lot in common. I mean, to use an issue that's cropped up recently in debate, the issue of pornography and prostitution, the
Yes.
libertarian would want to deregulate and the traditionalist would want to re-regulate. You couldn't possibly get
Right.
more opposing views. And in the old right, at least in America, the prevailing foreign policy view was one approaching isolationism. And of course, that was very
Right.
different than the Cold War hawks. So they had very little in common. It was an incoherent coalition, except they managed to accomplish exactly what they wanted to do. They won the Cold War through this improbable coalition. And it's why I don't really think that I think that the divisions between conservatives and libertarians have been a little overplayed recently, only in so much as all political coalitions are incoherent. They must be. There simply
Right.
are not enough people who think exactly the same thoughts, and politics makes strange bedfellows, but a politics of opposition can be very helpful. And so what we're seeing right now is a kind of libertarian traditionalist, classical liberal, moderate coalition that's
Mm.
attacking the hard left, which all of us see as dismantling our culture, even dismantling the distinction between men and women. Now, does that coalition make a whole lot of sense? Maybe not, but at least we have a common foe, and I think we could be successful.
Yeah, sure. So on that point, uh, sure, there's a lot of things that we agree on, probably among many other issues, small government. But what
Right.
do you think makes conservatism better than libertarianism?
Yeah, I tend to favor the more conservative approach or the traditional approach. I
Right.
think it's because all ideology is wrong. I think every
Mm.
single one of them is wrong. The human experience is simply too vast and complex to boil down to a manifesto. And I fear that libertarianism tries to boil down all of humanity to a manifesto. And
Or a
if
spreadsheet?
or a spreadsheet, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think back, actually, on that point, I think back to Edmund Burke, that first great modern conservative philosopher who lamented in Reflections on the Revolution in France. He said, "The age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded it, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever." And I just fear
Mm.
that the libertarian model, at its worst end, boils things down to a kind of materialist view of the world, which is crazy. Everything that
Mm.
we actually care about, our hopes, our dreams, our loves, our joys, those are immaterial things. And if
Sure.
all that conservatism means is cutting taxes a little more or bumping economic growth up a little bit more, while I love both of those things, I love low taxes and I love economic growth. But if that's all that our political philosophy is, I think it's pretty weak. And I don't think there's any way to make that argument, a bean counting argument, against the
Mm.
left.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And yeah, libertarianism could be a little bit more human, I
Yeah.
think, uh, to say the least. But I want to talk about trade,
Yeah.
because there is kind of a strong, and I think this even spreads into conservative circles, where there is this idea that trade is good for the sake of trade, and open trade is good for the sake of open trade, and that any type of protectionist measure or tariffs or taxes on any products coming into a country will necessarily affect the population. And
Right.
this was one of the things that actually I think united a lot of libertarians and conservatives when Trump started going after China.
Yep.
They said, this is going to devastate a lot of industry. Americans are going to start paying a lot more for products. And suddenly, it actually didn't go too badly.
Right.
Well, it went terribly for China,
Yep.
but on us, kind of negligible. Do you want to talk on that for a sec?
It was a wonderful moment because, one of the downsides to political success is that all
Mm-hmm.
your great ideas inevitably get boiled down into slogans. They have to be politically useful. And then the
Sure.
slogans become bumper stickers. And then we believe the bumper stickers are the philosophy. And we start to believe our own sort of shallow talking points. And one of those
Mm.
talking points was that there is absolutely no role for protectionism or tariffs ever in the conduct of politics. And it always hurts everybody and nobody benefits and there's no use to it. I was taught that growing up. I think most conservatives and libertarians, at least in America, were taught that.
Mm.
And Trump proved that the real story is a little more complicated than that because I believe it was Trump who asked the question. He said, if tariffs are uniformly awful, how come every country has them? Clearly, everyone else seems to think there's a role for them. And
Right.
that's what we saw play out. The doomsday predictions from people who said that any sort of protection would be devastating just didn't happen other than on our adversary. And when you look at the history of the Republican Party in America, the party
Mm.
was actually founded on protectionism.
Oh yeah.
Abraham Lincoln, who was the first Republican president, he said, give me a tariff and I'll give you the greatest nation on earth. And then of course our economic views changed over time, and Trump in his own way is vacillating on this. On the one hand, he says tariffs work and tariffs are great. On the other hand, he says, I want to get rid of all the tariffs and I want to have lower barriers to trade. Part of that, I think, is his madman strategy of negotiation. You never quite know what he's thinking. But
Right.
I think that space is a much healthier one for conservatives and libertarians to debate these questions of tariffs. Obviously, they have a role. Obviously, they serve a purpose. That's why they exist, and that's why they've always been used by countries. And the question is how best to use them to serve the national interest rather than some abstraction of a free international marketplace that sometimes has ill effects on citizens and very often doesn't function as people say it will on paper.
Yeah, sure. And that actually leads us really nicely into the next thing that I wanted to discuss, which is immigration.
Yeah,
So when it comes to immigration, there's kind of like a libertarian and also left-wing point of view
yeah,
that if you allow a lot of people into the country, just by the sheer force of having more people in your country consuming and spending, they will prop up the economy. And so there's actually no downside to mass immigration. And
right.
then you have people who are more conservative saying, well, we have to proceed with a little bit of caution. It's my own point of view that if we're exporting all of our low skilled jobs abroad, that it doesn't make a lot of sense to then import tons of low skilled labor. But
Right, right.
I mean, do you want to talk on this a little bit?
Well, that's an excellent point. I mean, of course, people are making this argument out of both sides of their mouth. They're saying we have to export all of our low skilled jobs overseas. We have to outsource. It's the way the market's moving. Oh,
Mhm.
and on the other hand, we're going to open up our borders and have no limit on low skilled immigration. That doesn't make a
Right.
lot of sense.
Mm.
The libertarian argument, I think, for open borders, it breaks down and because it highlights the insufficiency of libertarianism as a totalizing governing philosophy, which is that it treats human beings merely as economic objects or
Mm.
as material objects even. What it ignores is the effect of mass migration on culture.
Yeah.
Conservatives presumably want to conserve something, and the question is, what do you want to conserve? I mean, if we could have completely unfettered trade and totally open borders, and we could lower the cost of goods by 10%. That would be wonderful. But if, as a result of that, people no longer speak English in the United States, that's
Right.
not a worthwhile trade off for me. I would much rather pay a little bit more for my technological goods and cheap plastics and still be able to have a recognizable community with a recognizable culture. And so that's why the conservative view on this has not been one of completely eliminating immigration. That's never
Right.
been a serious view advocated, but it's one of evolution, not revolution. An idea saying there are other factors at play here. And to quote Ronald Reagan in one of the great speeches, Time for Choosing, that kind of kicked off the modern or the post-war conservative movement,
Mm,
he was himself quoting Winston Churchill, and he said, "When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn that we're spirits, not animals. The destiny of
mm.
man is not measured by material computation." And I think we need to keep that in mind when we think about immigration as well, because there's a lot more going on than just the price of wages or something.
Yeah, yeah, I broadly agree. I'm an immigrant in Australia, so
Yeah.
I don't want to be too hard on immigration, but
Well,
because
I come from a country that, well, I guess like Australia too. I mean, in a
Mm.
certain sense, everybody is an immigrant.
Yeah,
Half my family came from Italy, and then the other half were the kind of OG immigrants who came over on the Mayflower. But
right,
other than 400 years ago, nobody was here before then, and so
right.
America has always taken in new people. But this
Mm,
is the first time in history where we've more or less mass imported millions and millions of people per year. And
yep.
as a result, it, one aspect of politics is that it doesn't just exist in the abstract. It exists in real time. Right now, we have the highest foreign-born percentage of the population in the U.S. That we've had at least since 1890, and so it's
Mm,
created a lot of cultural tensions. It's created a lot of economic tensions as well, and so it would seem reasonable right now to restrict the flow of immigrants into the country. That might not be true 50 years from now, but politics as always has to be responsive to particular circumstances, and that's why some of our views now might be a little different than they were when we were fighting the Cold War, and they might be a little different than they were when we were fighting the Spanish-American War.
yeah,
That's
sure,
that's
and
just
no,
the nature of
and that
politics.
actually ties into what you were saying earlier about all ideologies being wrong. If you
Yeah,
think that one set of ideas is going to apply to every situation that it will ever occur ever,
yeah,
innocently, then I think that's narrow thinking. But I
right.
want to go back a few steps to what you said about conservatives conserving, because that's the last topic that I want to touch with you,
Yep,
which is I look at the conservative movement at the moment. Now, fiscal conservatism is kind of a fiction at this moment.
yeah, right.
Uh,
In terms of
Marriage,
government spending, you mean?
yeah, and
Right.
across the West,
Yep,
governing, yeah, for example, marriage.
yep,
That's something that wasn't conserved the way that it used to. Abortion was a law was a part of the movement that was lost by
yep,
conservatives, and
yeah.
I'm wondering, what are conservatives actually conserving? Like, what are the wins? Because I see a lot of right wing, reactionary kind of culture war politics, but I'm not sure where the conservatism is actually coming into play in
Right.
today's political sphere.
Well, when Bill Buckley founded the post-war conservative movement, he defined it as standing athwart history, yelling "stop," which is maybe not the most affirmative point of view. I mean, he's basically saying we're going to slow down the left as best we can and stop them from marching and running roughshod all over us. And there have been
Mm,
some major conservative losses during the Obama era. I mean, the redefinition of marriage at the level of the Supreme Court was simply monumental.
mm,
Uh, it's similar in the cultural enormity to Roe versus Wade. I mean, I think Roe
right.
versus Wade is a far more wicked decision because it's resulted in tens of millions of babies being slaughtered over the last
Hmm.
40 years. But similar cultural impact, I suppose. But Roe versus Wade gives us a little bit of hope because in 1973, when Roe versus Wade invented the fictitious constitutional right to an abortion, the
Right.
public opinion in the United States was moving very quickly in the direction of abortion. So states were legalizing abortion, they were liberalizing their laws. And then after Roe versus Wade, that stopped and the momentum went in the other direction. All of a sudden, you started to see what became the pro-life movement. I was just at the March for Life about a month ago in
Mm,
Washington, D.C. It was huge. I mean, upwards of 1 million people probably throughout the city. And there have been a lot of wins in recent years. I think of Georgia, I think of Alabama, I think of Missouri, other states
mhm,
around the country have done their best to curtail abortion rights. I mean, all the way back to the point of a heartbeat. I think of cultural advances like sonograms, specifically 3D sonograms, show people the lies of the pro-abortion movement, show them that it's not just a random clump of non-living matter, but actually there's a
mhm.
baby in there. And
Right.
so I think that's been one way that we've been able to recover. But the Obama years were really brutal for conservatives. And in
Yeah.
part, I think that's why you're seeing the reaction from President Trump. And President Trump's winning was different than a sort of just a Democrat to Republican shift. It was different than Bill Clinton going to George Bush. It was different in that because the changes were so fundamental under Barack Obama, you're now seeing a cracking up of the conservative consensus, which many of us think had become ossified, specifically after the Cold
Right.
War. And you're seeing programs such as this really debating now what conservatism is trying to conserve. And I think you've seen a lot of progress on the economic front. I think you've seen a lot of progress on the pro-life front under Trump. I think you've seen a lot of progress on patriotism. It had become very unfashionable to say I love my country. It had become unfashionable to say
Right.
a countryman ought to be able to control their own borders or something. That has now changed. On the deeper level, on a level like marriage, I think that there hasn't been a ton of progress. Actually, the cultural and sexual revolution had to get so far that they were denying that men are different than women in order for
Right.
us to say, hold on, wait a second, maybe the sexual revolution has gone too far. But specifically on that
Mm.
front, I think you're seeing this broad coalition of people who include not just conservatives or libertarians, but who include homosexual atheists and transgender people themselves, who are now saying, hold on, this gender ideology is too wacky.
Mm.
Child drag queens are a step too far, and they're kind of uniting. There was a good piece in the American Mind on this a week ago by Spencer Klavan, actually, who's
Mm.
one of the editors over there. I mean, saying that this broad new right coalition is really reacting in some ways to the excesses of the sexual revolution. So I think that gives us a glimmer of hope, but there's a real sadness that sets in when you realize how much has been lost. And I I think, getting back to our first topic, a lot of it has been lost
Mm.
because the right acquiesced to a more or less materialist vision of the world.
Yes.
They bought so many of the left's premises on, for instance, the neutrality of secularism, or the
Mhm.
primacy of material goods, and just consuming and consuming and consuming ever more. And I just noticed anecdotally in the last few years, I think the right has been shaken out of that, and they're readier than ever to engage on those cultural issues. Whether we've simply lost too much remains to be seen, but I think there's finally an eagerness and a consensus on the right that we've got to fight the cultural issues first, and then the economic and more narrowly political will follow. But if we try to ignore the cultural issues, we'll lose everything.
Yeah, true. Well, Michael, I won't keep you for too much longer. Thank you so much for being here, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Taxed and Wasted by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. If you haven't already, please go to iTunes or Podchaser and leave us a 5-star review. It helps more people find the show. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. You'll get every single episode in your newsfeed as you sleep. Don't forget the Friedman Conference is coming up. You can buy your tickets on our website, taxpayers.org.au. You can also see all of our campaigns there, our mission statement, and you can become a supporter. If you become a supporter, there is a great chance that you might get a free Friedman ticket or even a free VIP Friedman ticket, based on which tier of support you choose. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.